Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Department of Public Service's Stakeholder webinar, where staff will provide an overview of the changes to New York's EV Make Ready program, which were recently adopted by the Public Service Commission at the conclusion of the program's midpoint review. My name is Zerai Hagos, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Markets and Innovation here at the Department of Public Service, where I have the privilege of leading the clean energy, market policy, and transportation electrification work for the department. I'd like to thank each of you for taking the time to attend today's webinar. I'll also provide a special thanks to those of you who have been active during the midpoint review process for the program, which kicked off over a year and a half ago in August of 2022. Now, the primary mission of the New York State Department of Public Service is to ensure affordable, safe, secure, and reliable access to electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, and water services for New York State's residential and business customers, all while protecting the natural environment. The department also seeks to stimulate effective competitive markets for clean, renewable, and distributed energy resources that benefit New York's consumers. It is these last components of our mission that drives staff's focus in this proceeding, where we hope to eliminate barriers and stimulate investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure in support of our state's ambitious climate policy. The EV Make Ready program is, of course, the Public Service Commission's flagship investment in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The program now provides over $1.2 billion in ratepayer funding to stimulate over $4 billion in total investment in EV charging infrastructure across the state. After receiving extensive stakeholder feedback through written comments and during a number of technical conferences, the Commission adopted, with modifications, DPS staff's March 2023 recommendations for an improved Make Ready program, taking into account the evolution of the EV landscape since the program's inception. As my colleagues will discuss in much more detail during today's session, the Commission adopted updated budget totals that better reflect the market realities informed by real-world data observed from the first few years of the projects developed in New York's Make Ready program. The Commission also increased investments in disadvantaged communities, with expanded budgets, improved program designs, and new areas of support, such as micromobility programs. And finally, the Commission authorized a number of additional adjustments and right-sizing measures during the midpoint review process, which staff's team will expand upon during today's presentation. Put together, these modifications and additions will build upon the successes of New York's flagship Make Ready program to expand and accelerate the transition to the clean electric vehicles and mobility solutions required by New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. With nearly 190,000 electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid vehicles registered in New York as of December 2nd, EV adoption has increased by more than 3.5 times since the program was originally authorized in July of 2020. With the continued strength in electric vehicle sales and healthy levels of charging station utilization observed in many locations across the state, I remain optimistic and excited about the state of the market for EV charging in New York and the important role the Make Ready program will play in the continued growth, which will ultimately benefit consumers. I'll now turn the floor over to my colleague, Jen Roberton, who leads transportation electrification for the department, to describe the format of today's webinar and to begin the presentations. Jen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Roy. As mentioned, Jen Roberton. I'm on the EV team here at Department of Public Service, working under Zerai. I'm going to start by talking us through the agenda for today. So we went through introductions, and just I want to echo Zerai and say thank you to everyone who took time out of your day, especially as we're nearing the end of this year, to be part of today's stakeholder webinar. We'll be talking through relatively briefly the Make Ready program, just offering that overview in case there's any of you who have not been with us throughout this journey of the midpoint review. We'll then be talking about the midpoint review order that was authorized on the 16th of November 2023. We'll be providing a fairly in-depth overview of the order itself, and we'll also pause throughout for Q&A. So we'll have dedicated question and answer towards the end of the presentation, but we picked a few spots that felt strategic to stop and just make sure that there's no clarifying questions or additional thoughts from stakeholders between some pretty big topics. We'll then be talking through next steps as well. A few housekeeping items. Please remain muted throughout the presentation today. You can use the chat function or the raise hand function to ask questions of the panelists. We do have a team here at staff who are keeping track of questions coming through the chat function in particular. We'll be addressing those on a first come, first served basis. Also using that raise hand function if you do want to unmute and ask a question verbally or add anything to the question that you wrote out in the chat as well. We do love hearing from you during the Q&A. As mentioned, we have dedicated Q&A throughout and at the end of today's presentation, so definitely throw those questions in the chat and raise those hands. The session is being recorded. The link to the proceeding where you can find that recording after today's session once it's posted was added in the WebEx chat by my colleague Lindsay Weiner, so please take a look at that. Presentation materials and recording link will be posted there. And if you have any questions, want to reach out to our team, the right place to do that is evsc@dps.ny.gov. So with that, I'll start talking through the Make Ready program. So this is going to be very brief, but just in case, again, some of you maybe are newer to this proceeding or to this program. The Make Ready program was authorized originally in the Make Ready order. This was in July of 2020, and the Make Ready order originally authorized $701 million, primarily funding the Make Ready infrastructure needed to install charging. If I take your attention over to the right-hand side, this is a graphic kind of describing the type of infrastructure that's covered by the Make Ready program. You have the utility side work needed to install a charger, that transformer and utility service. You have the customer side equipment, that wiring, setup transformer, paneling, conduit, trenching, design, permitting, wiring on that side as well, switch gear, that's all eligible for Make Ready funds. The actual EV charger itself, as well as bollards and networking fees, so on and so forth, are not eligible for Make Ready funding. Take your attention down below the photo there. We have 3 different incentive tiers for eligible costs. So up to 100% of those eligible infrastructure costs are covered if chargers are serving certain disadvantaged community or DAC use cases. Up to 90% for public non-proprietary chargers, and up to 50% for private access or proprietary technology. The Make Ready order included $206 million in dedicated budget for disadvantaged communities. That was a 20% allocation of the Make Ready infrastructure funding for plug serving of disadvantaged communities at the up to 100% incentive tier. Additional programs were also authorized in the order, including the Clean Transportation Prizes at $85 million, the Medium and Heavy Duty Pilot at $15 million, and the Transit Make Ready program at $10 million. The order directed the midpoint review of the program budget, incentives, and additional needs, which we just wrapped up recently. So just to go through a timeline of where we've been and how we got here. So again, the Make Ready order was in 2020 in July. There was an order making some modifications to the Make Ready program in July of 2022. The midpoint review began in August of 2022. Staff filed the midpoint review white paper in March of 2023. The midpoint review technical conference that went through the content of the white paper was also in March 2023. We then had a series of stakeholder engagements, including a disadvantaged community webinar in April. We had a data reporting technical conference in June, a budget plug goal technical conference in July, a workforce development webinar in September, and that all culminated into the commission authorizing the midpoint review order in November of 2023. So with that, we'll begin an overview of the content of the midpoint review order. So the midpoint review order updates the plug forecast underlying the Make Ready program. A bit of history again, so the Make Ready order in 2020, those budgets and plug goals are based on national estimates and NREL's EVI Pro Lite tool. The Make Ready order targets 53,772 level 2 chargers and 1,500 DCFC plugs statewide by 2025. As of data we got from the utilities in August of 2023, there are 16,503 L2 and 1,115 DCFCs committed and completed statewide through the program. midpoint review white paper filed by staff in 2023 used historical data to update baseline costs, as well as a refined NREL forecast that found an increase in DCFC and a decrease in L2 needs. A few different factors that this was based on. There are new projections of residential charging availability. We also have our first ever multi-unit dwelling, or MUD, plug projection. The underlying program has always been focused really on publicly accessible plugs, but in this analysis, for the first time ever, staff had some outputs around the number of plugs needed to serve the multi-unit dwelling specific use case. There's a growing demand for electric for-hire vehicles. We've seen a ton of goals and mandates come through on that across the state. There's a proliferation of longer-range EVs than we had a few years ago. And there's also advances in the availability of higher capacity charging. That has been a big change in the types of infrastructure that is being installed in the DCFC space in particular. So take your attention over to the right, the midpoint order budget waterfall. So as a reminder, 2020 order, the budget's at $701 million. In the white paper, staff found an incremental budget need to support the number of plugs needed to have 850,000 EVs across the state as an incremental budget increase of $407 million. There are some stakeholder-driven revisions that led to a $135 million incremental increase, and that led to a total $1.243 billion budget. And this change in the budget really came from a variety of stakeholder feedback. So staff proposed that $407 million incremental budget increase in the midpoint review white paper. That again was filed in March of 2023 based on the updated plug forecasts and historical program data. And written comments and technical conferences, stakeholders encouraged staff to revisit the midpoint review white paper's budget to account for a number of different factors that were not considered in the white paper. Increases in DCFC costs as more favorable sites are developed. We know that sites that have existing capacity have continued to go rather quickly, which is great to see for the proliferation of DCFCs. But as that happens, there'll be more and more sites that need that capacity increase, that need that utility side and customer side upgrade. We know site hosts are providing multi-unit dwelling and workplace L2 plugs to the public to maximize their incentives. And we also know that there's additional medium and heavy duty pilot budget needs and disadvantaged communities. These are points of feedback that we got directly from stakeholders. So in the midpoint review order, the Commission revised the budget methodology to allocate incremental plugs by incentive tier and update the per plug baseline. This uses data from an interrogatory request filed by the utilities in August of 2023, and this leads to that $1.243 billion budget and the $542 million incremental increase from the 2020 order. So historical data really was a main factor in driving the refinements to the per plug baseline. L2 plugs were updated based on a weighted average of historical make-ready costs with separate values for upstate and downstate. So for downstate, we're meaning Con Ed and ONR, and for upstate, we mean NYSEG, RG&E, Central Hudson, and National Grid, just to be clear around that distinction. For DCFC plugs, the baseline was developed using an average cost per kilowatt to account for the range of DCFC capacities, then scaled to the cost of a 150 kilowatt DCFC to derive utility-specific baselines. Utility-side baselines were developed using only historical data from projects with utility-side costs to account for less favorable sites being available and higher anticipated costs. I'm going to dwell on that for a second and just unpack it a bit. So basically, when we derive the cost per kilowatt for DCFC, historical programmatic data was used. To get to the utility side of that cost per kilowatt, the projects that have utility side costs were the only ones that were considered to develop that side of the cost per kilowatt. For the customer side cost per kilowatt, all projects were considered as part of that weighted average, so including the projects without utility side costs. So the updated midpoint per plug baseline for L2, relatively straightforward. There's an upstate and a downstate figure. For upstate, the per plug baseline is 7,067. For downstate, it's 14,801. DCFC cost per kilowatt, they range by utility. You can take a look at that graph on the right-hand side to see the utility-specific cost per kilowatt baselines, but they do range from 451 to 1,111 by utility. To scale that up to a 150 charger, the range is between 67,614 to 166,585 when you're rounding to the nearest one. So the budget's really driven by data and forecasting. So going back to the midpoint review white paper, that analysis allocated plugs by incentive tier based on their location in the NREL forecasting. So in the original analysis done in the white paper, the assumption was that all workplace and MUD-L2 plugs would be at the 50% incentive tier, except for multi-unit dwellings in disadvantaged communities that receive that up to 100% tier. Building on stakeholder feedback that we received in written comments and throughout the stakeholder engagement through technical conferences and webinars, as well as the IR data that we received from utilities that validated the assumptions that we heard from stakeholders, the comments that we received from stakeholders, the commission authorized a budget that allocated incremental plugs by incentive tier using historical data. So instead of looking at the NREL forecast and making some assumptions around where plugs are located based on workplace and MUD likely being private access, we heard a lot from stakeholders and found this out in the IR data as well, that really a lot of site hosts are going after that higher incentive tier to make sure that they're able to maximize their incentive. So we basically took a look at the historical allocation of incentive tier by plug type. If I take your attention over to the right-hand side and that chart that has a series of percentages, that's actually the historical allocation for downstate and upstate of which type of plugs are allocated to which incentive tier. Those percentages were then associated with the incremental plug needs to develop some assumptions around the number of plugs that would reasonably fit into which incentive tier to work towards the appropriate budget allocation. I'll note for the enhanced tier for disadvantaged communities, there was additive budget to that specific tier that was added on top of that 25, 15, 17, and 36% respectively to get to the full 35% allocation for disadvantaged communities. And my colleague Maud Emerson will speak to that later on today, but it's to note that there was some additional work done specifically for those budget allocations. The admin budget for the program maintained at 15%, so no changes there. There were some changes to the program restrictions. So on Con Edison, incentives are capped at up to 6 megawatts, and no more than half of plugs will be at sites of more than 30 plugs. And all other utility service territories up to 3 megawatts, and no more than half of plugs at sites of more than 10 plugs. So note a few upcoming deadlines. So we have implementation plans and participant guides that will be filed by the utilities by January 12, 2024. The program will go through an additional review period. That review period will begin by the 17th of November 2025 or sooner if 70% of plugs are committed and completed. This is the overall budget summary. So you have a few different columns here. If I take your attention to the kind of first two columns, this is the disadvantaged community make-ready order budget allocations and the total budget allocations in the make-ready order. The sections that are bolded here, that's the midpoint review order, disadvantaged community specific budget, the midpoint review order total budget as well. And then we have the incremental budget towards the far right here as well. So you can see at the bottom right-hand corner, that's the $542 million incremental increase total to the original budget. So a lot there. I see a few questions came in through the chat, so I'm going to pause and we can start taking questions before we keep talking through the content here. And please feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. You want to ask them that way. I'm just taking a look at the chat here. So I see a question from Rachel Thomas. What does MHD stand for? And thank you to my colleague Lindsay who answered that question. It refers to medium and heavy duty vehicles, trucks and buses and that sort of thing. I see a question from Olivia Campbell to go back to the last slide, please. Olivia, if you're able to unmute, can you let me know what slide you're thinking of?
Just literally the last slide back, one back.
This one here?
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer,
Yeah, no problem.
are the incentive caps per project or per customer regardless of the project location?
For the caps, are you speaking to these program restrictions at the kind of bottom left here, or the incentive tiers?
Yeah, program restrictions.
The program restrictions are per project, so 6 megawatt and that 3 megawatts on a project level. And the no more than half of plugs per sites being at either sites of more than 30 or 10. It is project specific to a certain extent, but also is utility specific, if that makes sense. If a utility has a lot of larger projects, essentially, that will have an impact on the type of projects that can be approved going forward.
Got it, thanks.
Thanks, Olivia. Continue working down the chat here. So I see a question from Lindsay at EVgo. Sorry if I missed this, but when will the new programs go into effect? So the commission authorized the midpoint review order changes in November of 2023, and the updated implementation plans will be filed in January of this year, January 12th, I believe. Yeah, that's right.
And so, I'm sorry, is that the date then that the new program rules will be in effect, or will there be a lag?
It should be in effect with the new implementation plans.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Continuing down the list here, I see Melanie Franco. When does this new budget go into effect, or rather, when will the incentive dollars be available? Melanie, I think same question there. The program is authorized by the commission as of November, and the implementation plans will be kind of early next year, by the January 12th date, which I hope answers your question. Something I didn't mention at the top of the hour, if you can please put in your organization and either your name or when you ask a question, just makes it a little easier on our note takers. Melanie, I think we know that you're at Couch White, but please let us know if that's not true. I see another question in the chat. Hi, what was the Con Ed no more than half of 30 plugs that you mentioned in the previous slide? I'll go over it again. I know this one's a little dense in terms of the what we're trying to say here. So essentially, in Con Ed service territory, no more than half of the sites will have more than 30 plugs. Once we have relative to the plug goals, so let's just say the plug goals for utility would be let's just say for sake of simplicity, if utility had 100 plugs and other plug goals, that would mean that no more than half of plugs would be at sites of more than 30 plugs. So no more than 50 if we're using the example of 100 plugs per for an exemplary utility. Hopefully that answered your question. Please let me know if not. And I see a question from Scott. Will there be a link for recording and slides? Scott, there will be a link to both. The link is at the very top of the chat to the case number 18E0138. The recording for today, as well as the slides and related materials, will be uploaded on there shortly after today's session. Thank you. Maybe while we wait for other questions to dwell on, again, I'm keeping eyes peeled for hands raised. If anyone wants to ask that question verbally, please feel free to do so, keeping my eye also on the chat before we move on here. And maybe I can just continue to dwell on this program restriction just for a moment, since I know we got a lot of questions on that. So the limitations here are kind of twofold. We don't want sites to be eating up the majority of the incentives. So once we get into multi-megawatt sites, those sites are eligible potentially for a fair number of incentive dollars. These sites do serve really specific need. We know in Con Ed in particular, there's been a lot of action for high capacity sites, just given the particularities around off-street parking access and for higher vehicle EV adoption, and a lot of market forces that are really driving large DCFC sites. So we want that to happen. We don't want a certain number of large sites to eat up the entire incentive pool. Similar to that, the making sure that no more than half of plugs are at sites with more than 30 or 10 plugs respectively, depending on where those sites are located. There's a similar logic around wanting to make sure that we're not having incentive dollars go towards these larger sites, and not having a diversity of sites developed across the utility service territories. Continuing down the chat here, so I have another question come in. Can you explain the per plug baseline costs? Were those used to calculate the budget, or are they project-specific incentive caps? So they're actually both. It's a great question. So the per plug baseline cost determines the amount of money that a particular project is eligible for. So let's say you have a project that is serving a disadvantaged community under the specific definitions that we use, and we'll get into a bit of that in just a moment. But basically that particular site could get up to 100% of the baseline cost per plug, depending on the number of plugs developed at that site. And if that site happens to be not serving a disadvantaged community, but is publicly accessible and non-proprietary technologies being used, that's up to 90% of that per plug cost can be covered, and kind of down the list to a private access proprietary plug, up to 50% of that per plug baseline can be covered by the program incentives based on the number of plugs developed per project or per site. So that's kind of one side of how the per plug baseline plays into it. And the per plug baseline was also used to develop the program budget. So the incremental plug needs that were established through the analysis produced by NREL, those incremental plug needs are fed into a budget analysis that assumes a certain number of plugs at each incentive tier, and that then spits out the final kind of incremental increase in the program budget. So I answered that question. Thank you. I'm going to pause for any final questions in the budget section before I hand the floor over. Give it a good 10-second pause. Seeing nothing else come in the chat, I don't see any hands raised. So actually, I'll get us started for the next session. I'll hand the floor over to Maud Emerson, pardon me, for the next section. Take it away, Maud.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Hi, I'm Maud Emerson. I'll be talking through the disadvantaged communities aspects of the midpoint review order. I believe we advanced one slide too far, Jen. Thank you. The 2020 order that authorized the EV Make Ready program included a significant level of funding dedicated to promoting clean transportation solutions in disadvantaged communities. The midpoint review order brings that investment in disadvantaged communities to at least 35% of the total Make Ready program budget. The incremental funding for disadvantaged communities authorized in the November order totals $166 million, allocated across 3 program areas. The Light Duty Make Ready program, which provides enhanced incentives for certain projects in disadvantaged communities. A new micromobility pilot, which will support chargers for e-bikes and scooters, and incremental funding for the medium and heavy duty vehicle Make Ready pilot. We'll talk about this last one at more length later in the presentation. You'll move forward a slide. So here you can see a breakdown of Make Ready program disadvantaged communities investments. You saw something similar on a previous slide that Jen presented, but to show how these allocations add up to 35%, we have to remove the administrative and future proofing costs from the total budget and focus on incentives and other dollars going directly into projects. So that's what you see in this table. The second point I want to make here is that the 35% is really the minimum of program investments in disadvantaged communities authorized in this order. The light duty program disadvantaged community allocation only accounts for incentives at the enhanced tier, and there may be other charger installations in disadvantaged communities receiving incentives at other incentive tiers, right, the up to 50% tier, because they don't check all of the boxes for enhanced tier eligibility. So 35% is a floor rather than a ceiling. Next slide. Thanks. The light duty Make Ready program offers the highest level of incentives, the enhanced incentives we've been referring to, covering up to 100% of eligible costs for two types of charger installations in disadvantaged communities. These are publicly accessible DC fast chargers and level 2 chargers sited at multifamily buildings or multi-unit dwellings, MUDs. The midpoint review order makes some updates to the eligibility criteria for enhanced incentives based on the first few years of program experience. First, the order eliminates the eligibility radius for level 2 chargers. Previously, the program awarded enhanced incentives to level 2 chargers situated within 1 or 2 miles of a disadvantaged community in some parts of the state. That radius or buffer zone was already reduced to 0 in Con Edison's service territory in 2022, but this order makes that change statewide. The order preserves the buffer zone for DC fast chargers in upstate service territories. The reasoning behind that difference is that in less densely populated areas of the state, a DC fast charger located a mile away from a disadvantaged community provides a real benefit to EV drivers in that community. But the level 2 use case is different with its much longer time to charge, and it makes more sense to focus the enhanced incentives on level 2 chargers that are situated directly within disadvantaged communities. Second, the order expands eligibility to curbside level 2 chargers in disadvantaged communities. We received a lot of support for this change from stakeholders who felt it was important for the program to support this option for residents of multi-unit buildings who don't have access to off-street parking. And finally, the order adds premise-specific eligibility requirements for multi-unit dwellings, which I'll explain on the next slide. So this change was introduced in response to the observation that in the first years of the program, the enhanced tier budgets for level 2 chargers were expended rapidly in the downstate region, much more slowly upstate. It was also observed that downstate, some of those enhanced incentives were going to wealthier buildings within disadvantaged communities. And so to guard against the program disproportionately funding those wealthier buildings, some additional eligibility requirements were necessary. In Con Edison service territory, the midpoint review order adds premise-specific eligibility requirements for multifamily buildings that limit the enhanced tier of incentives to affordable buildings. That additional screen does not apply in upstate territories. In upstate territories, any multifamily building in a disadvantaged community is eligible for the enhanced incentive for level 2 chargers. And finally, the order extends eligibility for enhanced incentives to any building meeting the affordability criteria statewide. So affordable multifamily buildings are eligible whether or not they're located in a disadvantaged community. And you just see there in the box at the bottom, the criteria we're using to identify affordable buildings. Buildings must have an affordable housing regulatory agreement in place with a state, federal, or city entity that requires at least 25% of units to be affordable to households at or below 80% of the area or state median income, or the building must be able to demonstrate via rent roll that at least 25% of units have a calculated household income of no more than 80% of area or state median income. And again, buildings not meeting those requirements are still eligible for incentives, but not at the enhanced tier. Next slide. The micro-mobility pilot developed out of discussions between DPS staff and stakeholders about how the Make Ready program can best serve the clean transportation needs of disadvantaged communities. Staff was interested in finding ways that the program could provide benefits for residents of disadvantaged communities who don't own cars, much less electric cars, And we received a lot of feedback emphasizing the importance of micromobility devices like e-bikes to communities with low rates of car ownership. The micromobility program will take different forms in the downstate and upstate regions. In Con Edison and Orange and Rockland service territories, the order authorizes $20 million for those utilities to administer a micromobility make-ready pilot program. The program will provide incentives for micromobility charging stations in disadvantaged communities that are publicly accessible or located in or adjacent to affordable multi-unit dwellings. The incentives will cover utility side make-ready costs and up to 50% of customer side make-ready costs, including the cost of fire suppression equipment. Compared to the downstate region, the micromobility market in upstate New York is not as fully developed. So upstate, the order allocates $5 million to NYSERDA to administer a grant program for micromobility charging that fits in well with NYSERDA's other market development activities. And with that, I think we go to Q&A. And I would like to just remind you that if you have questions, whether you're in the chat or verbally, it would be great if you could identify yourself and your organization if you're affiliated with one.
Awesome. Thanks, Maud. We're keeping our eyes peeled on both the chat and for any hands that may be raised for any questions on the disadvantaged community specific elements of the Make Ready program and the modifications made in the midpoint review order. We'll give it just a couple minutes and keeping our eyes peeled here. Maybe just give it a few more seconds in case there's people typing, and we will have dedicated Q&A towards the end of the presentation as well on kind of all topics related to the midpoint review. So that's also a good time to get your questions in. If none come to mind just yet, but some come to mind later on, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we'll get to them. Okay, great. Seeing no hands up, seeing nothing in the chat, we're just going to keep going here to be mindful of people's time. But again, please feel free to throw any in there. Oh, I see one came in. Awesome. I see two, actually. That's great. Okay, so the first one here, and just a reminder, I know Maud just mentioned this at the top of the Q&A here, but please throw your affiliation if you're with an organization in the chat. This makes it a little easier for us to keep track and our note takers as well to keep track of who's asking what. First question here, I'm a little confused on the MUD eligibility. So is it Con Ed must be in DAC and meet eligibility criteria versus upstate just being a DAC and don't need to meet eligibility criteria, or outside of DAC and have eligibility criteria? So on this for Con Ed, yes, must be both in DAC and meet that eligibility criteria. For upstate, it's an either or, so be in a DAC or meet that eligibility criteria. But I invite Maud if there's anything you want to add on your end to clarify further.
No, that's right. And if if it still isn't clear, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask follow-up questions.
Right, awesome. Thank you for the question. Please let us know via the chat again, as Maud just said, or via hand raise if there's any more questions on that. We know it's a lot of content today, and the eligibility can be a little tricky to wrap your head around. So I appreciate the question. I'll read the next one down the list. We have Eric Gilliand from Recharge. Are shared micromobility programs such as City Bike or CDPHP cycles in Albany consider transit programs for the purposes of eligibility for funding programs? So for the micromobility specific programs, entities such as City Bike and the CDPHP cycles in Albany could be eligible to access those funds for, as a reminder, for downstate, for City Bike, for New York City within Con Ed, that would look like a Make Ready like program. There's a requirement for the infrastructure to be within a disadvantaged community as well, just to note that. For an Albany, that would fall under the Upstate program, which will be a grant program run through NYSERDA. So there could be eligibility to apply for a grant for the Upstate program. And again, invite Maud if there's anything you want to add on your end. I want to make sure that we're being clear that this is for the micromobility specific program. We do have a transit program as well that that this does not speak to. So we will speak to the transit authority specific program later on today. But for micromobility, yes, there is eligibility there. But I'll stop talking and invite Maud. Please add anything I may have missed or any further clarifications.
No, I think you covered it, Jen. Yeah, there's nothing in there that would exclude shared micromobility programs, as long as it meets the requirements that Jen mentioned.
Awesome, thank you. Continuing down the list here, we have Louisa from LIPA. Are there any new technology requirements that we should be aware of in the midpoint order? Louisa, we will speak to some different requirements around communication standards actually further on in today's presentation. So I'm going to put a bookmark in that question, because short answer, yes, but longer answer, we'll get to it in just a moment. More to come, and stay tuned. Let's give it another few seconds to see if there's any more questions on the content so far before we keep moving along here. All right, awesome. Seeing nothing, I don't see any hands up. I don't see anything coming through the chat. Just want to say thank you again to my colleague Maud for going through that disadvantaged community specific section on the midpoint review order. Looking at the time and the lack of hands up and questions, I'm going to keep moving along the content here. So regarding queue management and waitlist application process. So the midpoint review order directs the creation of an EV infrastructure interconnection working group, or an EVIIWG, that will convene to do a couple different things. It will convene to develop a statewide framework for EV interconnection. It will address application backlog issues and wait times. It will aim to streamline the interconnection application process, and it will also aim to be transparent. So Con Ed is to submit a straw proposal to the EVIIWG describing its efforts to streamline the interconnection process. This will take place by the 15th of March 2024. To note and dwell on that for a moment, there were acute queuing issues within the Con Ed Make Ready program just due to a ton of demand and Con Ed service territory, which is fantastic. The queuing issues were also quelled and dealt with by Con Ed. So we definitely want to learn from that experience of why the queuing issues were created in the first place and how to streamline that for all utilities going forward in a consistent process. Members of the EVIIWG will amend the proposal that Con Ed will submit as necessary for public notice and comments and formalize a statewide process. Once these processes are fully developed in the EVIIWG, this group may be subsumed into the existing Interconnection Technical Working Group, or the ITWG. So there's a acute need to address this within the EV programs, but this may be rolled into the broader efforts shortly afterwards as well. So with that, I'll actually hand the floor over to my colleague Nicole Solis to talk through data reporting.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sound good.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. So as you can see here, the original Make Ready order required program participants with installed EV chargers to provide several different data variables, each of which fell under one of 4 separate buckets, which included data concerning customer participation in the Make Ready order, data regarding the system of the utility in question and customer billing information, data on the actual plugs themselves and charging session information, and then finally financial information of the charging site in question. Staff received a lot of feedback on data reporting requirements from both the utilities and stakeholders, particularly at a technical conference held this past June, emphasizing many challenges to data reporting outside of obviously the added time and money that the process requires, but also specific barriers like network challenges resulting in inaccurate or even a total lack of data, as well as issues surrounding customer confidentiality. So in recognition of the legitimate barriers put forth by both the utilities and stakeholders, the midpoint review order pares down the original data reporting requirements of the make-ready order, for now focusing on the data variables that are of a higher value and currently more useful to staff. This includes the removal of 2 of the broader categories of data, both utility system and billing information, and then also financial information on charging sites. Despite the more streamlined reporting requirements, the utilities are also directed by the midpoint order to create an online tracker of EV plugs, which is to include information on the portions of the budget committed and on the number of plugs that are completed. And the JU will also work with staff to develop a data reporting compliance plan to distribute and provide to prospective network providers, which will not only include a preferred network list, but which will also emphasize to providers the potential consequences of not meeting the streamlined requirements. Next slide, please. So on this slide, you can see the midpoint orders must have streamlined data reporting requirements. And then on the left, you can see that these fall under the broader category of program participation. These data points consist of several really straightforward requirements like site ID, the number of plugs installed, nameplate capacity of the plugs, but it also includes a number of requirements that provide really crucial insight into the success of the make-ready program itself, such as the percent of service applications that have matured into operating stations, and then also data on site incentives and funding. For more information, at the bottom of the slide, you can see the location to the full list of the original data reporting requirements from the make-ready order. So you can see, the original requirements and then the differences between the 2 programs by cross-referencing them. So if there are no questions, next slide, please. And here on this slide, we see the midpoint order streamlined data reporting requirements under plug and session charging data. These requirements are also extremely straightforward. They consist of variables like the number of sessions daily per site, peak charging data, and annual aggregated charging data, as well as plug outage information, which is crucial to assessing the success of individual sites and ensuring minimum uptime requirements are met. Like the participation data on the previous slide, these data requirements also provide critical information in assessing the success of the make-ready program itself and will help staff to inform the commission, which will in turn help them to make determinations on actions going forward. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned in the last slide, one really important area of data reporting for staff is plug outage information, which is really key to ensuring those minimum uptime requirements are being met. The midpoint review order did maintain that the annual uptime requirements for DCFCs are 95% for the plugs themselves and 99% for the operating stations, with a minimum of 50% of the plugs operational. Additionally, in response to the make-ready order, staff received questions from stakeholders on things like what is meant by uptime and also suggestions on the need to provide kind of some form of standardization. So the midpoint order addressed these suggestions by providing formulas for calculating outages, both expected and unexpected. Those formulas are right there, and both the formula variables that you can see on the slide and the formula for expected outages are consistent with the DOE's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, formula program, which was also put forth by multiple stakeholders as the best option to be used. I think the formulas, while they might look a bit wordy, they are pretty straightforward, so I'll just pause for a moment and give everyone a chance to look at them. And if there are no questions on them at the moment, obviously, there will be opportunity again during Q&A. Oh, no, looks like we might have one in the chat. Danny from one's coming in. Can you specify how this applies to L2s? Okay, you know what? We're actually going to take, because so the section of Q&A that we have for this is coming up. We just have a couple more slides. So we will address your question shortly, Danny. Thank you for that. At the moment, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay, to talk about proprietary technology.
Thank you, Nicole. Can you confirm I'm coming in all right?
Yep, we hear you great.
Great. So the midpoint review order maintains the current incentive tiers of up to 50% for proprietary plugs and up to 90% for non-proprietary publicly accessible plug types. To receive the public incentive tier, an equal number of non-proprietary plugs must be present at a site with proprietary plugs. CCS and SAE J1772 are considered non-proprietary under program rules. All other plug types, such as CHAdeMO and the North American Charging Standard, previously known as the Tesla plug, are considered proprietary. Now, over the past 6 months or so, many vehicle OEMs have announced adoption of NACS in the coming years, and the Commission has directed staff to convene a technical conference in 2024 on proprietary plug technology to learn more about this shift in the market. So keep your eye out for that. Next slide, please. Coming out of work in the Technical Standards Working Group related to communication standards, the Commission introduced a few new program requirements. So first of all, hardware must be ISO 15118 parts 2 and 20 capable, effective for new incentive commitments as of December 16th of this year. And they must be software compliant by November 16th of next year. Additionally, new incentive commitments must be hardware compliant with OCPP version 2.0.1 or later, also effective November 16th of next year. And there is no third-party testing requirement for OCPP compliance. Proprietary extensions are allowed as long as the EVSE remains interoperable. And these determinations follow broad stakeholder support for the inclusion of these standards. And we'll just note that while these standards are, under the Commission's ruling, language consistent with NEVI requirements, this does not mean that the Commission would automatically adopt any modifications from NEVI without its own thorough review and justification. Next slide, please. So the midpoint order deems energy storage and automated load management systems eligible for make-ready program incentives. Bidirectional chargers are not eligible as they do not reduce or avoid the need for utility or customer-side make-ready infrastructure. On-site storage must be paired with an EVSE and only used for EV charging to be eligible for make-ready program incentives. And on the subject of VGI specifically, the existing interconnection technical working group was deemed the appropriate venue to discuss any interconnection challenges related to vehicle grid integration. And certain utilities were directed to file VETR value stack tariff updates to reflect that V2G and VGI are eligible under the tariff effective this upcoming January 1st, 2024. Next slide, please. The Commission determined that the utilities should require all make-ready program funded sites to display easy-to-find and up-to-date contact information for the electric vehicle service provider. This directive comes from feedback provided in the Customer Experience Working Group about drivers' difficulty determining who to contact to resolve various problems. The Commission declined to require that the site host or utility call center information also be listed on the charger, as was recommended in the staff white paper, following stakeholder feedback that 3 points of contact would be too confusing for drivers. Next slide, please. So stakeholders expressed general support to maintain existing EAM metrics, but did note that plug deployment thresholds were too high to effectively drive utility behavior. Certain stakeholders recommended a tiered structure as that might be more effective with a higher share of savings for higher deployment achieved. The Commission ultimately approved a 3-tiered EAM structure adopting the midpoint review's updated baseline costs, which Jen talked about earlier, and with those financial incentives beginning at lower plug deployment levels. And you can see on the bottom how those minimum, middle, and maximum tiers play out. The EAM measurement period ends December 31st, 2025. And summed together, the EAM awards under both L2 and DCFC metrics are not to exceed 15 basis points. Next slide, please. So the order maintains the existing approach for incentive tier eligibility as it relates to multi-unit dwellings, workplaces, pay-to-park lots, and residential make-ready. The focus of the Make-Ready program at its inception and still today does remain on that publicly accessible infrastructure. And the Commission found that the current eligibility rules and incentive levels provide a reasonable balance between prioritizing those publicly accessible sites while still providing some limited support to other significant use cases. Next slide, please. Consistent with the Make-Ready order, the Commission determined that the existing program requirements appropriately allow NYPA to fill market gaps without interfering where the private market is currently willing to build. So under that process, NYPA must file notification of intent to build, and then there is a 30-day waiting period to allow developers to note any co-location conflicts. Stakeholder suggested that a developer should be allowed to present an MOU as proof of build out, but the Commission found that since an MOU isn't non-binding, it does not, or is non-binding rather, it does not provide enough proof that a private entity would fill that near-term need in the area. And with that, I'll hand it back to Jen to take us through the remaining topics.
Awesome, thanks, Lindsay. So medium and heavy duty and fleet programs. So there were some modifications to the medium and heavy duty pilot. There is an incremental budget increase of $43 million to a $67 million with up to 90% of utility side and newly up to 50% of customer side make-ready being eligible. This $67 million budget includes the $9 million that was authorized in the Con Ed rate case. Again, customer side costs are included for the first time here, which is exciting. The customer side incentives are capped at the baselines established for the light duty make-ready program. We spoke through this way at the beginning of the presentation, but there is this cost per kilowatt baseline that is associated with the light duty program by utility. That will be the same per plug baseline or the same cost per kilowatt baseline that will be used here as well. There's also expanded eligibility to include publicly accessible locations as well as depots in disadvantaged communities. This also includes school bus depots, knowing that there's very aggressive targets to have school bus to electrify in the state. The medium and heavy duty pilot has the maintaining of the need for a qualifying incentive with a scrappage requirement for non-publicly accessible locations. The types of programs that have this eligibility have been expanded to include the EPA's Clean School Bus Program. This is a federal program with a scrappage requirement for new zero-emission school buses. So that's added to the list as incentives that can unlock the medium and heavy-duty pilot incentives for customers at, again, non-publicly accessible locations. Fleet assessment services. So the utilities are to develop a single online application portal for fleet assessments by the 15th of March 2024. And the utilities will be working with staff to identify capacity at school transportation facilities. For Transit Authority Make-Ready, the eligibility has been expanded to include electric make-ready needs for hydrogen dispensers for fuel cell buses, given need that has been expressed by transit authorities for incentives for this particular technology. Just want to note this isn't a ruling or a determination on the role of fuel cells writ large. This is a very narrow eligibility expansion that was in direct response to a need expressed by a transit authority that is really interested in this particular fuel type for their buses. And just an additional clarification that the chargers are not actually eligible. So this is only for the dispensers that are eligible for the make-ready funds. The actual hydrogen itself is not. So action on these topics will be taken up in the medium and heavy-duty proceeding. This is really exciting for us on the staff side. This proceeding was launched in April 2023, and expect to see a lot more action on school buses, transit, fleet assessments, above and beyond that, proactive planning, additional incentives and needs here. Within this new proceeding, we'll have some information around the end, but if you're not registered already, putting in a plug to please register for 23E0070. A lot of fun stuff will be happening there in 2024. I'll keep moving along here. The load serving capacity maps. So the commission directed utilities to expand the electric vehicle load serving capacity maps into electrification load serving capacity maps in a different order. This is the order directing energy efficiency and building electrification proposals that was authorized on the 20th of July 2023 and 18M0084. The utilities are to work with staff to develop updated maps by the 16th of January 2024. And a new thing here is that the maps will also be updated annually going forward. I keep moving along here, power sharing and future proofing. So the midpoint review order adopts that future proofing will have an 8% overall cap from the DCFC budget with 10% site-specific caps. For power sharing, the order adopts allowances for more customer side build out by establishing a minimum utility to customer side ratio of minimum plug count. I'm just noting for power sharing that the program always kind of allowed this to take place, but now this is a bit more explicit in the order. There's not enough information that was given to further modify future proofing allowances. There were some stakeholder comments on this, but no specific proposals or specific dollar figures or percentages mentioned by stakeholders. So there was a maintenance of the overall approach here. And the current program design, as I mentioned, does not prohibit power sharing. So this was always kind of a thing that could be done, but this is now a bit more explicit in the midpoint review order. So we had a ton of questions come in. I know there was a question during the last Q&A that I hope that we addressed, and some questions have come in throughout. So I'm just going to pivot right back over to the chat. But a reminder, if you want to ask your question verbally, please feel free to do so with the hand raise feature. And please throw your questions in the chat. This is our last Q&A. This is kind of the end of the presentation as well. So now is your chance to ask us questions. Going into the chat here, I'm going to go back to your question, Louisa, from LIPA on the new technology requirements that we should be aware of. I hope that this section of the presentation answers some of those questions or highlighted some of those requirements. I just want to highlight that there are requirements around proprietary technology. Certain plug types are considered proprietary and some are not, noting that the J1772 and CCS plugs are considered non-proprietary. So that's just something to be aware of to maximize the incentives. And also the requirements around ISO 15118 for hardware and software, as well as OCPP 2.0.1 or later. So hopefully you got that content in this section of the presentation. Definitely can loop back to any of those, whether it's communication standards or proprietary technology, if you want to delve into any of that a little further. But thank you for the question, Louisa. I'm continuing to work down the list. I see Danny from Flow. Thanks for joining us, Danny. Could you specify how this applies to L2s? So I think for this, I'm just going to pop back to that previous slide, and I'll take a first shot at answering this question. And definitely, Danny, let me know if I don't get exactly what you're hoping to get. I'm just going to pop all the way back to here. So there's kind of two things I want to talk through. First and foremost is the uptime requirement. And this is a DCFC specific uptime requirement of the 95% for plugs and 99 for stations. So there's no L2 specific requirements there. Where L2 comes into play is in the annual reporting requirements. There is an expectation and a requirement that we get annual data based on these formulas for all plugs in the program, including L2. So there is a data reporting requirement to have the outputs of the two formulas on the right-hand side provided from projects that are receiving Make Ready funds. But I'll pause there and feel free to unmute or add anything in the chat if that doesn't get to your question.
Yeah, so just on that, and thank you, Jen, for addressing the question. I'm curious, let's just say for L2s, the extension of the requirement, you find that certain projects built with Make Ready program dollars do not satisfy that. Is there any process in place to claw back incentives?
A great question, Danny. So there has always been the ability to claw back incentives built into the program itself. My understanding is that to date that provision has not been used. And going back to this slide here, just to point out that the data reporting compliance plan, which includes developing a preferred network list based on the ability to collect and provide data, is an attempt to kind of, from an educational standpoint, from almost a carrot standpoint, provide information to site hosts who maybe are a parking lot manager somewhere in the state, maybe a mall or something that really isn't in the weeds, isn't on this tech conference today, isn't on this webinar, doesn't really know the nuances of what provider can provide what data, just giving them the information on who tends to provide better data, and hopefully also providing stimulus for the market to adapt to these data reporting requirement standards. So that's kind of the first step here. So I want to emphasize that. We're also, there is some ability to claw back incentives. I'll note that something tricky with this is that in a lot of cases, it's actually the site host or that mall or that parking lot operator that receives the incentives, not the networks themselves. So there are, in most cases, it feels unfair to claw back incentives from the actual site host. At this stage in the program, especially where that information is not available on preferred networks, to claw back incentives when they're really not the ones managing the data. So hopefully that answers your question.
Gotcha. And then just one clarifying question on how this applies to L2s. Is there a specific floor for operational percentage that you're expecting, like there is with NEVI with the 97%, which carries both to the NEVI program, but also the charging and fueling infrastructure program maintained by USDOT?
Great question, Danny. So I'll pop back to this one. So the only uptime requirements are just in that second bullet, that sub bullet that's really DCFC specific. Hopefully that answers that.
Okay. This might be something worth considering at the 2024 technical conference for further discussion, just because you guys have such a significant budget allocated to the joint utilities for the deployment of level 2s. And I feel like trying to measure this in the way that has gotten pretty granular on this slide for DCFCs, but not trying to do it for level 2s is maybe an unintended consequence of the outcome of this order. So I would just encourage you guys to be thinking a little bit more about this, and we're happy to participate as a resource given our deployments in New York and what we've learned from that related to reliability.
Great, thanks, Danny, and great to see you on today's webinar, and hoping to see you more on these sessions going forward. We'll definitely a lot more conversation to come, especially as we get towards the next iteration of the review for this program too. So I appreciate the comments and the engagement. Thank you. I'm gonna keep going down the list here again. Hands up or throw your question in the chat there. I see from Rachel at Robinson and Cole, can you explain why bidirectional chargers are not eligible again? I'm going to pop over to that slide since I'm in the midst of clicking around anyway. So I just want to make a distinction on how the Make Ready program works, maybe first and foremost. So the Make Ready program doesn't provide funding for the charger specifically. So in cases where a bidirectional charger is maybe installed at a site, the Make Ready work, that customer side and that utility side work is eligible for incentives regardless of the bidirectionality of the charger. There are stipulations around plug type and communication standards. There are additional requirements that are definitely at play here, but the bidirectionality of the charger itself is not at play for the Make Ready specific funding, and we don't actually provide funding for chargers regardless of their bidirectional technology or lack thereof. So hopefully that answers your question, Rachel. And keep moving down the list here, and I'll stay on the slide for the next question. So I see this from Melanie Franco from Couch White. What does it mean when you say on-site storage can only be used for EV charging? So in this case, for the battery storage specific elements here, if a battery storage system is specifically for the EV chargers, so let's say maybe it's I know some models of EVSE have a battery storage integrated. There could be applications where the on-site storage is really just paired with the EVSE installation specifically. There is eligibility there. Where there isn't eligibility is if the battery storage is used for more than just the EV chargers. We know that there's a suite of programs and a suite of incentives in place for on-site storage that are not EVSE specific. And the intention here is to not kind of double up on incentives where you can receive an incentive for storage just existing period for a variety of use cases, and then having it kind of double incentivized if paired with an EVSE. Hopefully that answered your question there, Melanie, but please let me know if not.
That definitely answers my question of what you mean. I'm just wondering how it can be enforced, because I understand the need not to, or to avoid double incentivizing storage projects, but I mean, how can you enforce that the storage wouldn't be used to, for example, just improve reliability or resiliency, as opposed to directly for EVSE?
It's a good question, Melanie. I'm hopeful. I think the intention of the order is that would be clear in the engineering of the specific site itself. I mean, if you have an on-site storage that has conduit going to not the EVSE, then I'm hopeful that that would be a pretty clear determination of what's being used for what. But can appreciate that there's probably some nuances there too that we'll need to deal with on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Melanie. So I'm continuing to work down the list here. So I see a question come in from Alex Foucault from 9 Energy. Can you confirm that while bidirectional chargers are not eligible, utility side and customer side infrastructure up to the charger for V2G projects is still eligible for make-ready funding like they are for single directional chargers? Alex, I hope I answered your question by answering the earlier question, but the short answer is yes. Those make-ready eligibilities kind of stay the same in this use case.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks, Alex. Continuing down the list here, we have James Cater, Global Partners. Through what channel will NYPA notify developers of intent to build in GAP locations? Thank you for the question, James. I'm going to pop back to that slide too, just so we have it in front of us as we talk it through. So there's an existing process within the Make Ready program where NYPA must file notifications with intent to build. I believe you can find those within the proceeding itself. And then there's that 90-day waiting period to allow developers to note any co-location conflicts. So there's an existing filing requirement, and that would be the place to find it. Continuing down the list, anyone let me know if I'm not answering your questions, or if, again, hands up, unmute, kind of question in the chat. Maybe not everyone unmute at once, but an orderly hand raise maybe if we get a lot of action here.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks. It's James Cater. You said 90 days? It says here 30 days. Can you clarify?
30 days.
30 days. Okay, thank you.
Yep. I'm continuing down the list here. So Danny, we have a question from Danny Bloom, EV flow, EV charging. Does the order bifurcate the phase-in of plug and charge hardware capable requirements based on whether the charger deployed is an AC L2 or DC L3 charger? So the ISO 15118, going back here to the slide, so again, we have it in front of us. So there are no distinctions between the AC and the DC phase-in for both hardware and software compliance in the order. Hopefully that answers that question. I'm going to continue down the list. So we have from Olivia Campbell, ABB E-Mobility. Do you have a sense on potential timing for technical conference in 2024? I believe that this is referring to the proprietary technology specific tech conference. But I guess, Olivia, can you throw me a thumbs up or let me know if that's right?
But I was also, Jennifer, wondering if that technical conference applied to just the proprietary or other issues, because there's going to be some real technical challenges also on the compliance with the ISO for level 2 in the industry. And so I just wasn't sure if some of the timing didn't really get to have a technical conference earlier in this proceeding, and but that's helpful to get a sense of for that technical conference that you all are seeing it is in connection with plug type and not a broader technical discussion or to be determined.
Yeah, definitely. No, Olivia, that's a great question. So there's kind of I think two things at play here. There is going to be a convening in 2024 on proprietary technology, just regarding the NACS announcements that took place between the staff's white paper and the commission order. I have to say, curious to see how that rolls out. We've heard from OEMs that NACS will be part of some model year 25 upcoming, so curious to see how that goes. There could be some timing around when those announcements take place for our tech conference. Staff doesn't have a solid date to share just yet. We definitely will share that with stakeholders when we know more. And I'll also share this on the proprietary technology piece. I think part of this and part of the thinking on this is if we're in a mode where NACS is a popular plug type, it's a widely available plug type, and we're in a place where I think many of us are seeing CHAdeMO phase out, and convergence is perhaps taking place around NACS, potentially around CCS for fast charging. I think that's to be determined, and we definitely want to hear from all of you on what you're seeing or what you're adopting as well from folks in industry. But for proprietary technology, we may be thinking through whether it be software or hardware specific conventions that could lead us towards what is proprietary and what's not. I don't want to say anything with certainty right now, but we know that there's been some issues with just plug length for folks trying to use the Tesla charger. The plug's just not being long enough, or the cord's not being long enough to plug in. Maybe there's some hardware stuff there that we can converge around. Maybe there's software compatibility on whether you're able to use an interoperable app to access certain chargers, or whether you need to be tied to a specific OEM or a specific kind of entity to access those chargers. There's a lot to unpack there. That's not in the midpoint review order, but want to tee that up because hopefully folks on the line now are excited to delve into that with us in 2024. That's kind of part one of my answer. I'll share on part two on the ISO standard. We definitely have heard a lot from the joint utilities, and folks from industry have reached out to staff sharing concerns on the AC level 2 availability. We're aware and discussing that both internally and with our colleagues at the joint utilities as well, and as well as with industry. Potentially more to come on that, but just want to note that this is a directive from the commission. So at this point in time, these are the rules and regulations of the program, but want to hear you all loud and clear for those who have reached out to us, and I suspect we'll have ongoing conversations on this in 2024 as well. Hopefully it gets to your question. A lot of more to come, but just want to make it clear that we are definitely delving into both of those issues.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. Continuing down the list here, and again, keeping an eye peeled for those hand raises as well. I see a question from Van Nguyen. The order also designates the Technical Standards Working Group as the venue to address non-interconnection barriers for BGI. Does staff have an estimate on when those meetings will be held? Van, no specific estimates at this point in time, although we're aware that there'll be imminent meetings necessary in 2024. A lot of action needed here too. Just given that we don't have a date yet, just want to note that we definitely want to hear from stakeholders. I know that there's a lot of stuff happening in 2024, and we have to get our own ducks in a row as well. It's also really helpful for us to hear where stakeholders and industry is interested in delving into a topic more. So if you want to submit questions to us or get more into the non-interconnection barriers for BGI that are on your mind, Fan, or anyone else really, please submit those questions to evsc@dps.ny.gov. We'll throw that email in the chat again too towards the end of the session, so you all have it. But that's a great way to get in touch with staff, and it's helpful for us to hear from you ahead of a convening, so we can develop an agenda that is useful and really gets to the topics that are top of your mind. So please, Fan or anyone else from BGIC or any other stakeholders, please feel free to shoot us an email. Continuing down the list, I see a question from Alex regarding the webinar recording. Thank you, Lindsay, for throwing that in the chat. So if you click on that link to the case 18E0138, you'll find the recording there, as well as the presentation material. So kind of a PDF of these slides. From Danny, from Flo, appreciate your willingness to hear concerns about ISO 15118 requirements. Thanks. Thank you, Danny. And maybe since we're towards the end of the chat for now, I'm just going to type that email in the chat just to make sure you all have it so you know how to get a hold of us. That's a great place to send over questions or ideas that you want to hear from the staff team. Awesome. Thanks, Dan. I see you have your hand up. Or Katie, sorry. Hey, Katie.
Hi, Jen. It's Katie Zellner from Con Edison. I actually have a clarifying question on the section before when we were talking about L2 enhanced benefit eligibility at MUDs. Just wanted to clarify because I think that Ayana Dunmore had asked about the premise-specific eligibility for MUDs, and wanted to clarify that we're all interpreting it the same way, that the premise-specific eligibility is for the Con Edison service territory MUDs only, but that applies to MUDs regardless of their geographic location. So within a DAC or without. Do I have that correct?
So correct me if I'm wrong, Maud, but I think in Con Ed that they're both additive onto each other, whereas in outside of Con Edison, they act separate, where you can be in a DAC or meeting the MUD eligibility. But Maud from our team, you've been more in the trenches of this issue than myself. Can you please let me know if that's correct?
Yes, so in Con Edison service territory, the additional premise-specific requirements are an additional screen within disadvantaged communities. So it limits the buildings within disadvantaged communities that are eligible for the enhanced incentives. But within Con Edison service territory, it also applies that affordable buildings meeting those affordability criteria that are not in disadvantaged communities are eligible. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So we're saying the same thing, just in different ways, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Precisely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. I think the order language is good there. So it was helpful. Good job writing that order paragraph. That's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Maud, for stepping in there. So I do see we're losing some folks. So I do want to just start talking through next steps on this proceeding and kind of overall on our EV matters. I'm going to skip back ahead. Hopefully you aren't getting a headache by me jumping back and forth. Do feel free to continue to throw those questions in the chat. The staff team can't stay on. We just want to make sure you get all the info that you need ahead of the holidays. So I just want to, as a quick reminder, that we do have 3 ongoing EV proceedings. Right now, we're talking about 18E0138. This is primarily focused on passenger vehicle infrastructure, charging infrastructure. This has the Make Ready program, which primarily funds the electrical infrastructure needed to install charging. We've talked a ton about that, so I won't dwell on this one for too long. But want to mention that within this proceeding, we also have residential managed charging, which incentivizes customers to charge their vehicles off-peak at home when there are less impacts on the grid. There's also an ongoing device testing initiative within this program where we're testing the EVSC, the managed charging software, and the EV telematics. There'll be a filing on the results of this testing in October 2024. There's also a proceeding that deals with beneficial rates and demand charge alternatives for EVs. This is 22E0236. Through this, we have the commercial managed charging program, which incentivizes customers to charge their vehicle off-peak with a focus on fleets and public stations. We have demand charge rebate, which is a rebate to reduce the demand portion of a customer's bill by 50% for some EV charging use cases. We have EV phase-in rate, which are time of use rates of demand charges blended in over time as customers' load factor increases. We have electrifying MHD and planning for vehicle charging load under 23E0070. TBD on what this will look like, noting that we had our initiating order on this proceeding in April 2023, and that this proceeding is established to address challenges to bus and truck electrification, as well as proactively planning for load from EV charging. We've gotten some stakeholder comments in this proceeding back in June of 2023, and there have been 3 technical conferences so far on medium and heavy duty, as well as proactive planning in October and November, respectively. And just noting, once you see this uploaded up on DMM, if you've made your way to 18E0138, these other titles at the top of these columns are hyperlinked to get you to the other 2 proceedings as well. The next steps, and we had a few questions on what's coming next for the Make Ready program and upcoming stakeholder engagement opportunities. There's a forthcoming engagement through the Electrical Vehicle Infrastructure Interconnection Working Group, or the EVIIWG, that will be launched by the 15th of March of 2024. We'll have a proprietary technology technical conference in 2024 as well. Stay tuned for a program review by the 17th of November 2025 or earlier, depending on plug goals. So just stay tuned for that as well. So I'll pause for any additional questions. I'll keep my eyes peeled for any hand raises from stakeholders, and we'll give it another couple seconds, and then we'll potentially call it for our last engagement of 2023. I'm hearing nothing. I'm seeing nothing. I really appreciate everyone's time this afternoon for joining us towards the end of this year. 2023 has been a really fantastic year for action on electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. I really appreciate the kind notes in the chat as well. We look forward to collaborating with you all in 2024. Oh, Scott, I see you have your hand raised. See if you have a question. Maybe that was a high five.
I'm good, thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Scott. All right, thank you everyone so much for today's conversation, for the questions, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all. Have a great end of the year, everyone. Happy New Year.